Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Court of Everything. Today on the podcast, we have Kathy Kasic. Kathy is an award-winning cinematographer and director for science and natural history documentary films. Most recently, Kathy field directed for BBC's Earthshot Repairing Our Planet, which featured the King, David Attenborough, and Prince William. Her work has been featured on BBC, National Geographic, PBS, History Channel, Animal Planet, Discovery Channel, CBS, and NPR. And in this episode, we discuss her new award-winning documentary, The Memory of Darkness, Light, and Ice, revealing surprising discoveries about the Greenland ice sheet. As always, give us a follow on Instagram at Copod, COE and Twitter at The Copod. That's COE Pod. Enjoy the episode. So your new documentary, The Memory of Darkness, Light, and Ice, sort of opens with the uncovering of a secret sub-ice Cold War base, which comes as sort of a surprise early on, but it's sort of a history lesson.
Well, Camp Century is a very interesting idea. I think that most people would find it very intriguing that the US military decided to build a camp underneath the Greenland ice sheet. And it wasn't just a camp for like three or four people. Like it's not like some igloo or something. This is a camp for like a hundred men because there were no women that actually stayed there. There was one woman who came and fixed the nuclear reactor. But other than that, there were 100 men, and they lived underneath the ice sheet. They had, a dining hall and a hobby shop. They had a nuclear reactor, as I said, and this is something that the U.S. military did, sort of like at the height of the Cold War in the 1960s. They were going to hide missiles, nuclear missiles, underneath the ice sheet in a project known as Operation Iceworm. And it didn't really go very far. That part never really happened because they quickly learned that the ice actually moves. And they didn't really understand ice properties at the time. And we now know, of course, that it's sort of like water. Well, because it's basically water and it's
Water,
frozen
yeah.
and it moves. And if it's not melting, it still moves because it's just ice. Um, and so the camp actually collapsed under its own weight. They evacuated everything. Nobody was hurt. It was just they quickly realized that it was failing. But before they did that, they actually had some science that they did. They took the very first ice core out of the entire length of the Greenland ice sheet. And a lot of people have understood that. They've studied it extensively, looked at the atmospheric conditions when the ice was laid down. But at the bottom of that ice sheet, they also happened to take sediment. And they didn't really know how to date that at the time. They didn't have a lot of methods for figuring out sort of when the last time was that it would have seen the sunlight. So they put it in a freezer, thought maybe, it's sort of like, keeping a body in a freezer for a long period of time, seeing what happens if maybe it could revitalize itself. And so, sure enough, they moved it around from one freezer to the next, and it ended up in the Niels Bohr Institute for Ice and Climate, and it was found. And then they started to study it, but only about well, actually, this is probably about 7 years ago now.
Obviously, you said it was very male dominated at the time, but it wasn't until another scientist, who was a female scientist, hypothesized later on that the atmosphere would be hotter with higher CO2. And that was a lovely reference to someone who's probably seemingly forgotten, and the paper was only rediscovered in the 21st century.
It was pretty amazing. So Eunice Foote actually in 1856 did some sort of early experiments with CO2 in a bell jar, sort of added different gases of different kinds, and and then put them out in the sun, and then did a temperature test. I mean, it's a very basic experiment, and if you do that, you'll find that CO2, the jar containing CO2, will heat up faster than the other jars. And so she concluded that, oh, if you had CO2 in an atmosphere, you would likely heat up the atmosphere faster than if you didn't have the CO2 in the atmosphere. And so then it became the sort of greenhouse gas idea. But it wasn't until later that people kind of continued those experiments and then they learned more and more about it. But her experiment was the first one that ever happened, and she had a male colleague develop. Sorry, she had a male colleague take that to the AAAS meeting, which was the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She was not allowed to present it um, because she was a woman. So they presented that science, and yeah, so that was in 1856.
Wow. And when it
Um,
was published, was she the first author on it, or was she just one of the co-authors, or
yeah, it was. Yeah, I believe it was just her paper. What did she publish it with? I'd have to go back and look at the paper to remind
no?
myself. But I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I mean, it's her paper.
Right,
That's
okay, right.
yeah.
But it wasn't really recognized until maybe rediscovered as well in the 21st century.
Exactly. It was, well, it was overshadowed by Tyndall, who had also done a similar experiment, slightly more complicated in nature. But that's not why they didn't recognize hers. Her research was never disputed or it just wasn't highlighted.
And did Tyndall use her work as a foundation for his work?
It's unclear that everything that I've seen has said that maybe he didn't. He sort of was doing it simultaneously a few years
Hmm,
later. So I
okay.
don't think it was a scooping thing. I think it
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a lack of recognition more than anything.
Yeah, of course. If she was well, if the science itself was well received, then I don't know if he'd used it, even if it wasn't published as a building block for his stuff. But I'm
Well,
glad you
that's great. He could have been
recognized
at the
that.
meeting, at the AAAS meeting. I don't know for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
But let's get back to Greenland.
Yeah.
So we had this full ice core, and at
Yep.
the bottom of the ice core was this bit of sediment, tiny bit of sediment. Why is that piece of sediment that was long lost from the 70s and now has been found again, or at least now is actually being studied? Why is that such an important piece of core?
Why is that sediment so important? Well, whenever you have sediment, it tells you about the land, right? And ice will tell you about when the ice fell. But when you have sediment, it can tell you what the life would have been like before there was ice. And so it essentially just tells us when the ice sheet was gone,
Yeah.
which is pretty amazing. Um, and like if if one doesn't believe that necessarily, if you look in the sediment and you find plant life and bug life, there's really nothing that you can say to refute that because plants and bugs don't live underneath ice.
And it's like there's a combination of sort of freshwater bugs and birch tree leaves and all these different tiny little elements, which shows you what the environment would have been like before the ice was there.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Exactly. It's sort of a reconstruction of the past environment.
Do we know what happened to the planet? I mean, this is maybe thinking about the future, but what happened to the planet when the Greenland ice sheet last melted?
416,000 years ago, that's the age of the topmost part of the sediment. So in 416,000 years ago, it was a sort of warmer environment. CO2 levels were half of what they are today. So there's a beautiful graph that Tammy Rittenauer shows in the film where you can see, just sort of the ice loss and that correlates exactly with the CO2, which is really important, right? So if you have high CO2 in an atmosphere, you tend to have less ice. And so then you can just sort of look to the future to us, and you can see that um, we still have a fair bit of ice, but the CO2 levels are going way up. So there was generally less ice in the atmosphere, or sorry, in the environment back then, but the CO2 levels were half today. And really, the thing is that our CO2 has just been pumped into the atmosphere so quickly that that's why we're not seeing this like immediate loss of ice. It takes a little bit of time before the system catches up and everything melts.
Yeah, until it finds equilibrium, right? Does
Yeah.
anyone know what that kind of lag phase would be? You
You
know?
know, it really depends on the warmth of the environment and for how long. That's just what I've understood from all the scientists who are specialists in this area. They tell me that it's the duration of warmth that's important, but also the amount of CO2. So No one has an exact number of, oh, this is exactly how long it'll be to the minute, you know?
Hmm.
There are models that are being developed all the time, some of with input like from this study and other input. You know, the more input that they have in the models, the more accurate they can be. But we still are learning about our planet so much. You know, I mean, like if you just even take the Greenland ice sheet, for example, you know, we have this one core, this nice sediment core from Camp Century, which is in the northwestern part of Greenland. But we also need cores of other areas. In the film, we show a map where if we can understand where the ice melted, where it retreats from first, we can start to understand, you know, what's the most vulnerable part of the ice sheet. And so that's really important. If we are able to, if we want to understand that, we need to take cores from different parts of Greenland. And if we don't do that, we really just won't know where the vulnerable parts are of Greenland. And so we'll just be rolling the dice to see, all right, well, I don't know exactly how long it's going to be. The more information we gather about the past tells us about the future. So my short answer to your question is I don't think anyone fully knows exactly the answer. We know that by 2099, we're headed towards a lot of things being underwater.
Right.
And that's already a problem.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So by seeing where the ice is melted in the past, we can see where it is going to melt in the future, more likely to anyway, which areas are more vulnerable. So then we can
Yeah.
calculate the amount of melt that would occur and how much would be added to the oceans. So what is the worst case scenario? What is the worst case scenario if the Greenland ice sheet were to melt?
7 meters of sea level rise. That's 21 feet. So
Yeah, that's a lot.
that's a lot. It's a lot underwater. We have some sea level rise maps that we show in the film as well. And what's also kind of interesting is that you don't have kind of a uniform sea level rise. So what I've also been told is that if you have like northern Greenland when it melts, it's going to affect the planet differently than say when southern Greenland melts, or you know, the ice sheets from that side, or when Antarctica melts, there'll be different coastal areas that'll be affected. So it's not like, you know, it just like you lose an ice sheet and like everything melts exactly the same way, you know? And so understanding which ice sheets are more vulnerable to collapse is really helpful because then you can start to make a plan for cities in the future. At at 1 meter of sea level rise, you already have parts of Shanghai underwater. You have parts of Florida. If you lose 7 meters of sea level rise from Greenland, that's the entire loss of Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet, then you find large parts of Florida and the Gulf Coast, if you want to call it Gulf of America or whatever you call it, um, underwater in that area too, and all the way up the coast of the eastern United States. So these are real concerns that scientists have, and really, I hope that after people watch the film, they start to understand that the climate science is really important to fine tune models and to fine tune our understanding of where things are going to melt and how much and how quickly.
It's problematic that you look at the eastern US coastline and a lot of areas are very heavily urbanized along the coast because obviously ports and stuff like that. Kind of terrifying.
And there's this theory that people who are talking about climate change, that somehow they're just doomsdayers, and that's just sort of part of what humans do is that we just have this doomsday scenario. Um, But the reality is that there is a large amount of science and understanding going towards climate science. There, there's real data and real evidence to show that we are warming our planet by putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's very simple. It's very simple. You know, you look at Eunice Foote's experiment, and we're basically just magnifying that on a large scale take, a globe and put a lot of CO2 in it, and it goes up into the atmosphere, and it warms the earth. And so it's a very simple concept.
The thing is, I think we're in an astronomical phase where we actually technically should be cooling,
That's right.
whereas because of our contribution, we're actually warming.
Yeah, that's right. We are in the astronomical phase where we should be cooling. There was a fear back, I think it was in the 70s, they thought that the planet would be cooling. And I believe it's because of that, because we are meant to be cooling. But then when you look at the fact that we are putting all this CO2 in the atmosphere, all the models suggest that well, we can see that we are increasing our parts per million every year. They're going up. I mean, we have actual physical data showing that we have an increase of CO2 in our atmosphere.
The CO2 in the atmosphere is obviously it's extortionately high. I assume it's been higher in the past. That's not related to humans, but it's the rate of change at which it's increasing is kind of scary as well. I
Hmm.
think that's what's kind of also irrefutable in the data is that the speed at which CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere and the rate at which the planet is warming is what's kind of scary.
Yeah, that's right. It's I in the film I talk about other climate films that have shown, the yeah, basically that have been concerned about the same problems. And you take a film by Frank Capra in 1958, and I show the parts per million from then until the parts per million today, and it's just been steadily rising the whole time, and we are still rising. Our emissions are still rising. So the point is I guess, is that if we know logically, if we can say, okay, well, we are putting CO2 in the atmosphere, and we know that it warms the planet, the solution then is to stop putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere, to stop putting so much CO2 in the atmosphere. Um, because if we can look to the past and we can see that CO2 uh, e equals essentially a warmer environment, then we know that this is what we should change. I mean, it's a very simple argument. Obviously, the solutions are more complicated. The changes that are needed require a lot of coordination and, yeah, collaboration. And that's what I think I would like to see for the future more and more. All this infighting between Democrats and Republicans, and people saying that there's false news about it. It's just not true, and it's time to take a deep breath and say, okay, let's just get down to work. Let's fix this problem.
False. It's false news, I suppose.
Yeah.
One of the things you said at the end uh, of the documentary was maybe we'll be remembered as the bold stewards that learned to live sustainably with the planet. Um, in that attitude, I sort of thought about it a little bit and I thought, well, you know, this idea of stewardship, we're the ones that put it into this predicament in the first place. Um, but I guess, do we still get to choose how our species is sort of remembered, as it
Hmm.
were? You know,
Do, that's the question. Do we get to choose? I think we do get to choose, a little bit, right? I mean, history is always written by, oh, I don't know, whoever is the winner of the whatever it is. And I don't know if there's going to be a winner or a loser in this situation. I think there's going to be people who survive or don't. And so I suppose we'll be remembered if we have descendants in the end, I mean, if we don't have descendants in the end, then obviously we're not going to be remembered. And if we have descendants who appreciate what we did, then we'll be remembered in that way, right? And so I think it's about like looking at it and saying, okay, this is the problem of today. Can we make their life better in the future?
and you ended the documentary with, I think it's kind of the a metaphor, looking back at Camp Century and how the
Mm.
walls are now closing in due to melting. Was that a reference to the fact that the Earth will be here long after we've gone? It's the imprint that we make on it that's important.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's just always something that you might start out thinking you're going to try to save the earth, but actually you quickly realize that it's not about trying to save the earth. I mean, one little bit of understanding about the planet, and you realize that no, okay, it's fine. The planet will continue on. The species on it may not really. We may not really continue on. I mean, you just have to look at the fossil record to know that species throughout time have gone extinct and things have changed, and there's change is kind of inevitable on our planet.
I always sometimes wonder what our fossil footprint would look like in the future.
Mm.
We'll have the massive buildings and cities, but I wonder what that would look like, 5 million years from now.
Right. Yeah. What does that beautiful sort of sustainable idea look like? That does it look does it look different in the future if with a sustainable planet? Like imagine that we were able to um, have renewable energy and kind of live within our means, but yet still have progress and have human invention um, and potentially still have all of the species that exist today. What does that look like? I mean, to me, it feels like it doesn't have to look drastically different. It could look maybe like mm, we respect nature in a different way, that we try to have more places where we preserve nature, where we recognize that fisheries need to be taken care of, that we don't wreak havoc on those environments, that we make sure that there are enough trees and that there's life, that actually, in order for our own happiness, we have to have that nature as well. I don't think that there's a person on the planet that would say that we should get rid of all of nature, even people who are sort of afraid of nature, I think, recognize that there's beauty in looking at the world outside. Um, so I think that we'll find, if you were to construct what that sustainable future looks like, it's not a sustainable future where we're living in caves. It's a sustainable future where there's buildings, but they're environmentally sound. They're using renewable energy, and yeah, I feel like. Um, we just have to, we've learned our lesson about industrialization. We've learned what we can't really do to this planet.
People love watching nature documentaries and looking at the polar bears and the whales and love quoting David Attenborough, but it's too far removed from everyone's daily life. How
Mm.
can separating plastics and paper in a bin like relate to a turtle in the Pacific Ocean? It's such a far removed idea. And there are so many books and documentaries and they're all fantastic, but you know, is it the most efficient way to inspire action, or is it how much do we have to do to get that message across? Or is it across? People are making drastic lifestyle changes. The message is probably is there, but you know, what else can one do to try and shift that, as you say?
Yeah, like, is there a better way to try to convince people that a sustainable future is not only doable, but actually maybe better for us?
Okay, let me say exactly that, and then and then I can say it as my own question. No, exactly, yeah, exactly. That is the question I was going to ask you. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting question to ask somebody who started out in wildlife filmmaking. Um, I um, I think that yeah, that it's to me some of why I like to film wildlife and beautiful environments is to show people what is on our planet
Mm.
and how beautiful it is. It's I just spent the last few hours outside. I live by a river called the American River, and it's my next documentary project. It's the celebration of life, of the American River, and it is. so simply beautiful to watch a Canada goose. You know, they're like they're like the rat of the river because they're just everywhere, you know, but they're so beautiful the way the water glistens off of their feathers and the way they dip their head in and they squawk at each other, or the turtle when it jumps off the log into the water and then swims back up to see if you're still there, or, you know, all the little things that happen in nature that are just so simple. Like you don't really need much, you know, to just appreciate and to say, wow, that is gorgeous. And the new leaves that happen in spring, you know, the beautiful little leaves, they're just leaves. It's nothing, you know, but looking at them and seeing how fresh they are and how green they are, it's new life. And gosh, I mean, to appreciate that and to learn to say, you know, I'm going to put my phone down and I'm going to walk outside and I'm going to spend 3 hours out there because it is just simply beautiful. And I am on this planet.
Yeah.
I'm alive, you know. We've lost track of that.
I mean, I agree. Seeing the beauty in things is it's a very nice way to live it, also fulfilling life as wasn't it as well, isn't it? To see the cherry blossoms and go, wow, look at the cherry blossoms. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily see it because they don't have that kind of passion for nature. It's
Mm.
this, and it's people like that, which, and that's fair enough. And it is people like that that you sort of try to, a nature documentary might not tug at their heartstrings.
No, absolutely. I think that that's very true. And maybe those people, I had an interesting conversation with the guy who I worked with on my previous documentary, The Lake at the Bottom of the World. It's a film about a group of scientists who find a lake hidden 3,600 feet under the ice sheet in Antarctica. And John Priscu, he's the chief scientist, and he has done a lot of work sort of thinking about how you can find life on icy moons and places like that. And so he has had a lot of conversations about going to Mars and thinking about who's going to Mars. And I said, John, why on earth would anyone want to go to Mars? Like, it's far worse of a planet than planet Earth. You can't go outside without terraforming it. You know, I mean, it sounds horrible to me. And he's like, Kathy, the kind of people who want to go to Mars are like already in a cubicle, so they don't care where they are.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, that's probably why I don't understand. So I do think that there are different kinds of people. We make up the world in a most beautiful way. You know, not everybody has the same interests or excitement for things. But everybody does need to survive, and even if you don't particularly like going outside or being part of nature, you do also still have to eat. You know, we have food that has to be made and maintained, and we know that ultra processed food is not really that good for us. And so, you know, agriculture, fish, or, you know, any kind of, you know, agriculture or fisheries, those kinds of industries are very important for our survival. And we know that, um, you know, even like the honeybees, for example, there's been a decimation of honeybees. Like I think that something like 60% of the honeybees have died this year. So that has to do with all kinds of factors, one of which might be pesticides, the pumping of pesticides into our environment. So there's a lot of different factors that go into thinking about the health of our environment that don't just necessarily relate to whether or not we think it's aesthetically beautiful. It's also sort of part of our survival.
My friends that are sort of working in FIDI or something like that, and I'm like, they don't care about the new blossoms in the trees, you know.
No.
And it's kind of difficult then to get that
How do
message
you?
across. Not they're not environmentally conscious, of course they are, but it's just different levels, isn't it, of empathizing with the beauty of nature, I suppose.
Right, right. I mean, I think that there's two sides to it, or there's probably multiple more than two sides, but one of the sides is to be thinking about diversity of the planet, and the other part of it is to be thinking about our own human survival.
Yeah.
So, and those are intertwined. We know that.
Dilemma between thinking about our own human survival, but also being stewards of an earth,
Hmm.
but whether or not we can call ourselves that from what we've already done.
it's better to call ourselves a steward than a destroyer. So, yeah. I would much rather use the word steward, even if I know that the earth is just fine and doesn't need us to take care of it
Yeah,
necessarily. I think we're taking care of our habitat, basically.
right. Yeah, we're renting.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're tenants of Earth, you know.
that's right.
And you
Yeah.
don't want to destroy your own home, do you?
No, you want to leave it better than when you found it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nothing worse than going into someone else's house that you've decided to rent, and they've totally trashed it before you get there. And then you have to spend all this time in your life fixing it up and making it better.
Yeah.
Couldn't they have just made it a little bit better before I moved in?
Then they could have charged more rent, and then yeah, I
That's
wouldn't have
right.
minded.
Yeah. Well,
Kathy, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. We've done a good half an hour. Tell people where they can go to check out your stuff.
absolutely. Well, you can go to Metamorph Films. It's my website. I have a number of things on there too. I have a YouTube channel, and this film will be eventually available on Amazon and iTunes and other streaming platforms throughout, as is another film, The Lake at the Bottom of the World. So,
Fantastic.
but I have
Brilliant.
a couple of questions for you. Like, what do
Please.
you think? What do you think we should do to make this world a better, more sustainable place? What could I do better to try to make that message come across?
Well, I think part of your documentary was so nice was that you actually you took a deeper look into science, into what's actually going on in science. I think that's one thing that's kind of people look at nature documentaries and they see the whales or the polar bears dying, but they don't know necessarily the science that's going on. And I think that's kind of helpful. People understanding the amount of work it takes, the amount of months and years it takes to creative development in science. I think that's quite important. Convincing someone that their standard of living wouldn't diminish,
Mm.
um, or at least just making a change in the way people live doesn't necessarily mean it gets worse. Is another way of doing it, but I that's not for me to say. That's purely subjective, because whatever someone might think is a worse standard of living.
The thing that we mentioned in the film is that the economy is already taking a hit. The insurance companies, for example, once the insurance companies decide they're going to stop insuring people, then if you're buying a home with a mortgage, you need insurance in order to get the mortgage. And if you can't get insurance, then you can't get a mortgage. And then that means housing prices fall. And when housing prices fall, then the economy takes a hit. And so we're already seeing a lot of that throughout the United States. And we're not even very far along in the whole climate change journey. So, so I think that what I also would say, I guess, about the idea that we don't want to have, we don't want to take a hit, um, sort of economically with moving towards a sustainable future. It's that if we don't move towards a sustainable future, we're actually probably going to take an economic hit. So no matter what, we're looking at that, and I think that the sustainable future allows us to control the hit better. Whereas if we don't have the capacity to if we don't change what we're doing, we're looking towards an uncontrolled future. And and already our world is hard to control, right? We already know that. But once we move to the climate uncertainty, that's when we no longer are going to be able to control those economic hits.
Well, that's good. That's a good way of convincing my friends in FIDO.
Oh, okay, good. All right.
Fantastic.
Yeah, tell them to come talk to me if they need to.
I will do. I'll tell them to go see the documentary.
Great.
When's it out? It'll be out later.
Well, it should be July. Yeah.
Fantastic. Kathy, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's really been fun. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. All right. Take care.
You too.